I woke up to the sound of quiet beeping. That slow, steady rhythm hospitals always have, a mechanical heartbeat, faint but constant. My head felt heavy, my throat dry. I blinked against the fluorescent lighting, waiting for the grogginess to pass. The last thing I remembered was the anesthesiologist telling me to count backward. Then nothing. But I was awake now, so that meant the surgery had gone fine. No complications, just a routine procedure in and out. At least that's what I thought. A nurse stood beside my bed, checking my IV. She was young, dark hair pulled into a ponytail, eyes focused on the chart in her hands. She barely looked at me, just did her job, quiet and efficient. But when she reached for my wrist, her expression changed. She checked my ID bracelet, paused, her brow furrowed, lips pressing into a thin line. It wasn't much, just a flicker of hesitation, barely a second long. But in that sterile, silent room, it stood out. Something was wrong. I asked if there was a problem. She blinked, too quickly, and forced a smile. No, everything's fine. Then she turned and walked out. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was still foggy from the anesthesia, misreading things. But then it happened again. A few hours later, 2 more nurses came in. They spoke in hushed voices as they checked my chart, their glances darting toward me, then back to each other. I should have ignored it, should have just closed my eyes and let it go. But then one of them reached for my wrist, and I saw it, the way she stiffened, the way her face dropped for half a second before she masked it. The same reaction as before. This wasn't in my head. Something was wrong. I waited until they left. Then I lifted my arm and looked at the plastic band circling my wrist. My stomach dropped. The name printed on it wasn't mine. It was close, similar even, but definitely not my name. And underneath it, in bold black letters, DNR. Do not resuscitate. A cold wave of nausea rolled through me. My pulse thundered in my ears, every part of me screaming that this was bad, really bad. This wasn't just a typo. It wasn't some minor clerical error. A DNR order meant something. It meant if something happened, if my heart stopped, if I suddenly coded, no one would help me. I stared at the letters, a sick, sinking feeling twisting in my gut. How long had this been on my wrist? Since before surgery? Had the doctors seen this? Had they made decisions based on it? I hit the call button. A nurse came in, her expression too neutral. I held up my wrist. This isn't mine. She froze, opened her mouth, closed it again. Then, without answering, she turned and rushed out. I barely had time to process it before another nurse entered. Then another. Then an older woman in scrubs, someone higher up. She sat down beside my bed and folded her hands in her lap like she was about to deliver bad news. And then she told me the truth. There'd been a mix-up. At some point during my intake, my bracelet had gotten swapped with another patient's. The DNR patient. I asked if my doctors had seen it, if this had affected my surgery. She hesitated. Then she assured me everything had been fine, that my actual medical records were correct, that it was just a harmless mistake. Harmless. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But when I asked about the other patient, the one who should have had this bracelet, her face darkened. She hesitated, shifted in her chair. Then she admitted it. That patient, they were found unresponsive this morning. No pulse, no effort made to revive them, because according to hospital records, they'd already signed a DNR. I left as soon as I was cleared, didn't stay a second longer than I had to. I should have felt relieved that I caught the mistake. But all I could think about was how close I'd been, how easily they could have wheeled me into the wrong room, seen that little label on my wrist, and I try not to think about it. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up with the phantom sensation of that plastic band still pressing against my skin. And I wonder, if I hadn't noticed, would I have ever woken up at all? The grogginess felt wrong. I knew what post-surgery fatigue was supposed to feel like. That sluggish, heavy-limbed exhaustion. The lingering fuzziness from the anesthesia. This wasn't that. This was deeper, like my body was shutting down piece by piece. I was in the hospital recovering from a routine procedure. Nothing serious, nothing life-threatening. Just a minor surgery that had gone smoothly, or so the doctors said. I was supposed to be feeling better by now, but every time I tried to stay awake, a thick, syrupy exhaustion dragged me under. I couldn't focus, couldn't think. Something was wrong. I told the nurse. She smiled, nodded, told me it was just post-op fatigue. Normal. She adjusted my IV drip, checked my vitals, and assured me I was fine. I wasn't fine. By the second night, I could barely keep my eyes open. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart sluggish, my limbs unresponsive. The world around me felt distant, like I was sinking into the mattress, like I was slipping into something I wouldn't come back from. I told another nurse. She glanced at my chart, nodded, told me I was probably just taking longer to recover than expected. She was wrong. The head nurse came in the next morning. She was older, sharp-eyed, no nonsense. She checked my chart like the others had, but this time something changed. Her brows furrowed. She stepped closer to my IV, staring at the bag hanging from the metal pole. Then she lifted it, examined it, turned it in her hands, and then her face went pale. She grabbed my chart again, flipping through pages with quick, jerky movements. She wasn't saying anything. I asked her what was wrong. She didn't answer. She just unhooked my IV and pressed the call button. More nurses arrived, then a doctor, then another. They whispered to each other, stealing glances at me like I wasn't supposed to notice. I noticed, and I noticed when they took the IV bag and slid it into a biohazard container instead of the normal waste bin. I was awake now, more than I had been in days. My heart hammered, my hands clenched the blanket. I asked again, what was wrong? The head nurse hesitated. Then she told me I had been given the wrong IV medication, but not just a mix-up, not some accidental clerical error. Someone had peeled off the original label and replaced it with a fake one. A near-perfect replica, carefully printed, carefully applied. I wasn't being given the fluids I was supposed to be on. I was being given something else. Something that made me weak. Something that made me sleepy. Something that kept me from fighting back. The hospital immediately launched an internal investigation. Security footage was pulled. Staff were questioned. And then they found it. Footage from the previous night. At 2:47 a.m., a nurse had entered my room. Or at least someone dressed as a nurse. She or he, they couldn't tell, wore a standard uniform. Face mask, gloves, a calm, unhurried posture, as if they belonged there. This person had walked straight to my IV, checked the bag, then left. No rush, no panic, just a quiet visit. There was only one problem. The hospital had no record of them. No employee matched the figure in the video. No shifts corresponded. Whoever they were, they didn't work there, and somehow they had access to the medication storage. I was discharged the next day. The hospital never told me what I'd been given, or how close I had been to whatever was supposed to happen. They just apologized, reassured me they were looking into it, and I'm sure they did. But I never got a follow-up call, never saw a news report, never found out if they caught the person who had stood by my bedside, watching me sleep, making sure I stayed under just a little longer. I still wake up at 2:47 a.m. sometimes, heart racing, body frozen, and I wonder, was that the first time they came into my room, or just the first time they got caught? If you're drawn to tales like these, consider subscribing to Spectral for more chilling entries waiting to be uncovered. And if you have your own haunting story that you'd like featured in an upcoming compilation, we'd love to hear it. Just email us at spectralentries@gmail.com. Now, let's get back to the video. Hospitals are full of ghosts, not the kind that haunt old houses or whisper from dark corners. Paper ghosts, names on forgotten charts, unfinished forms, patients who slipped through the cracks. I thought that's what I had found. I was wrong. It started with a blank space. I was going through patient discharge records, cross-checking the ICU logs against billing files when I saw it, an entry that had never been closed. Patient, Daniel Rhodes. Admission date, 2 weeks ago. Discharge date. No end date. No attending doctor listed. Just a name and a room number. Not that unusual. The hospital's filing system wasn't perfect. Patients sometimes got discharged before the paperwork caught up. But when I asked the ICU nurses about him, their responses were all the same. That name doesn't sound familiar. I don't remember anyone in room 314. Are you sure he was here? That was the first red flag. The second was room 314. That's where the file said Daniel Rhodes had been staying. Except room 314 had been empty for the past week and a half. I checked the hospital's live patient registry. His name wasn't there. I checked the system for transfer records. Nothing. No follow-up appointments. No family contact. No insurance claim. He had just vanished. At this point, I was curious. I dug into the security logs, pulling up the footage from the night of his supposed disappearance. And there he was, Daniel Rhodes, sitting upright in his hospital bed, staring at the wall. For hours. Then, around 2:30 a.m., he moved. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up. Just like that. No struggle. No hesitation. And then he walked out of the room. Here's the problem. His injuries should have made that impossible. I didn't know the details yet, but from the chart notes, I saw words like blunt force trauma, multiple fractures, collapsed lung. A man in that condition doesn't just get up and walk away. I kept watching. The security footage followed him as he walked down the silent halls. No limp, no stiffness, just smooth, steady steps. He didn't stop at the nurse's station. He didn't check out. He just kept walking, through the halls, through the lobby, and then out the front doors. The last frame showed him stepping into the parking lot, disappearing into the dark. No one stopped him. No one even noticed. I should have left it alone, but I didn't. I wanted to know who he was, so I went to check his admission records. And that's when I found the third red flag. There were no admission records, no intake forms, no emergency contact. No doctor had signed off on his care. No one had ordered his meds. There was no record of Daniel Rhodes ever being admitted to the hospital. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I checked everything again, searching for any trace of him, but there was nothing. Officially, he had never been there, but I saw him. The nurses saw him. The security cameras saw him. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, sitting there in the hospital bed, staring at the wall, waiting. But for what? The last thing I did was check one more record, the ICU death logs, and that's when I found it. Patient with no name. A John Doe admitted 3 weeks ago. Same injuries, same room. Time of death? Exactly 2 weeks before Daniel Rhodes walked out of the hospital. Hospitals are full of ghosts, not the kind that rattle chains, just names on a chart, or a man who was never really there.